Have you ever watched someone destroy their own family while believing they were protecting it? Not because they were evil. Not because they hated anyone. But because they were so convinced they knew what was best, that they never stopped to ask what their child actually wanted. My dear friends, my name is Eleanor Brooks. And tonight, I want to tell you about a woman named Grace Harper. A woman who was rejected in front of an entire church, only to become the one person everyone would eventually need. The story began in Savannah, Georgia. Grace was 32 years old. A branch manager at a community bank. Hardworking. Independent. The kind of woman who remembered birthdays, brought soup when neighbors were sick, and never arrived anywhere empty-handed. For nearly 2 years, she had been engaged to Ethan Walker. A kind man. A loyal man. But not always a brave one. Especially when it came to his mother. Lorelei Walker had raised Ethan alone after losing her husband. She loved her son fiercely. But somewhere along the way, love became control. And control became fear. Lorelei was terrified that marriage would take Ethan away from her. So when she met Grace, she didn't see a future daughter-in-law. She saw a threat. What nobody realized was that Lorelei already had another woman in mind. A woman named Vanessa. Charming. Polite. Carefully rehearsed. Everything Lorelei believed a wife should be. And as Grace walked toward what should have been the happiest day of her life, someone else was already preparing to take her place. She just didn't know it yet. And neither did Ethan. Not until the church doors closed behind her. And everything fell apart. The trouble began long before the wedding. When Lorelei moved into Ethan and Grace's home for a few weeks, Grace welcomed her with an open heart. She cooked. She cleaned. She adjusted her schedule. She tried to make the older woman feel respected. But nothing seemed enough. If dinner was delicious, Lorelei found fault. If the house was spotless, she noticed dust. If Grace stayed quiet, she was cold. If she spoke up, she was disrespectful. At first, Grace thought she simply needed patience. But deep down, she was beginning to realize something painful. The problem was never her. What Grace didn't know was that Lorelei wasn't acting out of simple dislike. Years earlier, Lorelei had struggled through poverty after losing her husband. She spent decades believing that financial security was the only protection a woman could trust. When she met Vanessa, she saw someone ambitious, wealthy, and socially connected. In her mind, Vanessa represented safety. Grace represented uncertainty. It wasn't fair. But fear rarely is. Instead of learning who Grace truly was, Lorelei judged her through old wounds and old fears. And those fears were about to cost everyone far more than they imagined. 3 weeks before the wedding, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Lorelei invited Vanessa to family dinners. Praised her constantly. Compared her to Grace in subtle but painful ways. Ethan noticed. But every time he tried to push back, guilt stopped him. Lorelei would remind him of the sacrifices she made raising him alone. And Ethan would fall silent. That silence hurt Grace more than the criticism itself. Because disappointment from a future mother-in-law was one thing. But watching the man she loved refuse to defend her felt like a warning she didn't want to hear. The wedding day arrived beneath clear Georgia skies. Guests filled the church. Flowers lined the aisle. Everything appeared perfect. Then, moments before the ceremony began, Lorelei stood and made an announcement no one expected. With Vanessa seated beside her, she publicly questioned whether Grace was truly right for Ethan. The room froze. Grace felt every eye turn toward her. Humiliation washed over her. But the deepest wound came when she looked at Ethan. He wasn't defending his mother. He wasn't defending Grace. He was simply standing there. And in that moment, Grace understood something important. Love without courage is fragile. Grace didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't beg anyone to choose her. Instead, she quietly removed her engagement ring. The church became silent. Even Vanessa looked uncomfortable. Grace turned toward Ethan one final time. Waiting. Hoping. Giving him one last chance to stand beside her. But fear held him in place. So Grace nodded slowly. Then walked out of the church with her head held high. The guests would later remember that moment for years. Not because of what she said. But because she said nothing at all. And still spoke volumes. The months that followed were difficult for everyone. Vanessa and Ethan eventually married. At first, Lorelai believed she had won. But reality proved more complicated. Vanessa wasn't cruel. She simply cared about different things. Status. Appearances. Control. Gradually, family finances became intertwined. Decisions became arguments. Trust became transactions. Meanwhile, Grace focused on herself. She earned a promotion at the bank. Bought a small home of her own. Built a life that belonged to her. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to earn anyone's approval. And that freedom changed everything. 2 years later, the cracks finally became impossible to hide. Vanessa had convinced Ethan and Lorelai to invest heavily in several risky business ventures promoted by her friends. The returns never came. Arguments grew frequent. Savings disappeared. Then came the moment that changed everything. A bank discovered irregularities in financial documents connected to one of the investments. Ethan was shocked. Lorelai was terrified. Vanessa insisted it was all a misunderstanding. But for the first time, Ethan didn't immediately believe her. The trust he had once given so freely was beginning to break. And reality was finally demanding answers. The investigation revealed something worse than poor investments. Several documents had been altered. Signatures had been moved between forms. Critical financial information had been hidden. Vanessa denied everything. Then she produced emails that seemed to place responsibility on Ethan. For a moment, he was trapped. Lorelai was devastated. But this time, Ethan didn't run from the problem. Instead, he reached out to the one person he knew understood financial systems better than anyone. Grace. Not as a former fiancé. Not as someone to rescue him. But as a professional whose integrity he finally respected. Grace agreed to review the records. Not because she owed Ethan anything. But because the truth mattered. As she examined the documents, she noticed inconsistencies others had missed. Dates that didn't match. Approvals entered after transactions occurred. Digital records that contradicted printed copies. Piece by piece, the real timeline emerged. Vanessa's evidence began to unravel. For the first time, Ethan actively participated in fixing the damage. He gathered records. Answered difficult questions. Accepted responsibility for his own mistakes. The man who once stood silent in a church was finally learning what courage looked like. The final confrontation happened in a conference room, not a courtroom. Vanessa arrived confident. She believed the documents she had prepared would protect her. Instead, Grace calmly presented a complete timeline built from banking records, transaction logs, and authorization histories. One by one, the contradictions appeared. The room grew quiet. For the first time, Vanessa had no explanation. More importantly, Ethan did something he had never done before. When pressure mounted, he didn't look to his mother. He didn't look to Grace. He stood on his own. He openly admitted where he had ignored warning signs. Accepted responsibility for decisions that were his alone. And refused to let anyone else carry the blame. Lorelai sat silently throughout the meeting. Watching the consequences of years spent controlling instead of trusting. Later that evening, she asked Grace for forgiveness. Grace listened. But she didn't offer easy answers. Some wounds require honesty before healing. And for the first time, Lorelai was finally ready to hear the truth she had spent years avoiding. Grace met Lorelai for coffee 3 weeks later. Not because everything was fixed. Because healing deserved a chance. The older woman looked different. Not weaker. Just humbler. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Lorelai finally said the words she should have spoken years ago. I spent so much time trying to choose your life for you, that I forgot it wasn't mine to choose. Tears filled her eyes. Grace listened quietly. The apology felt real. But real apologies don't erase history. They simply create the possibility of a better future. Over the next year, their relationship slowly changed. Not overnight. Not perfectly. Trust returned one conversation at a time. One honest moment at a time. As for Ethan, his journey was harder. He spent months rebuilding his life. Accepting responsibility. Making decisions for himself. Learning that being a good man required more than having a good heart. It required courage. Eventually, he asked Grace if they could start over. Not where they left off. Not as the people they used to be. But as two adults who had learned painful lessons. Grace thought about it carefully. This time, she didn't make her decision out of love alone. She made it out of self-respect. Because she no longer needed someone to choose her. She had already chosen herself. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Years earlier, she walked out of a church believing she had lost everything. What she actually lost was a future built on silence. And what she gained was far more valuable. Her voice. Her confidence. Her independence. The wedding that eventually followed was much smaller. No drama. No grand speeches. No attempts to control anyone's future. Just two people standing side by side. As equals. And when Grace looked into the crowd, she saw Lorelai smiling. Not because she had won. But because she had finally learned to let go. Sometimes the strongest families are not the ones that avoid mistakes. They are the ones willing to learn from them. And perhaps that's the lesson hidden inside this story. Love without respect cannot survive. Control disguised as love eventually causes pain. And forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is allowing growth to happen after the truth has finally been spoken. My dear friends. Before we say goodbye tonight, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved because they refused to respect your boundaries? Or have you ever been given a second chance that changed your life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly enjoy reading your stories and the wisdom you share with one another. And if Grace's journey touched your heart today, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our Family Story Corner. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful stories to people who may need them most. Remember, a healthy family is not built on control. It is built on respect. Until next time, my dear friends. Stay safe. Be kind to yourself. Cherish the people who truly see your worth. And sweet dreams. The end.